how did somebody you know ruin their life in one day? In college, my ex's friend was pulled over for speeding. He had drugs and alcohol in his system, and when the cop reached in his truck to grab the keys, he panicked and took off, thinking the cop would let go. The cop did not let go, and was dragged for quite a ways before eventually falling to the ground and hitting his head, resulting in his death. My ex's friend was charged with capital murder and sentenced to 20 years in a Mississippi state prison. 21 years old, and ruined his entire life in one night. K-Buddy from high school blew through a stop sign and hit a couple of motorcyclists, ing them both. He didn't stop to render aid and fled the scene. He was busted for vehicular manslaughter and spent 12+ years in prison. He's lucky he can work for his dad, because where he lives now is not kind to felons trying to rehabilitate. We need to end stigma for felons trying to rehabilitate back into society, because otherwise, they go back to prison because they genuinely don't have much choice but to do illegal to get by. It's really sad. Insane though. I'm curious, how long do you think he would have spent in prison if he did stop and render aid? Friend's son was with his recently engaged fiancée who had a serious nut allergy. They were driving not far from Bendigo. They stopped off at a cafe to buy sandwiches. The woman running the cafe assured them there were no nuts anywhere near the sandwiches, so they bought them, then went on their way. Driving out away from town, she was nibbling on the sandwiches when she struggled to breathe. He stopped the car, got out, figured what was going on, went to the back of the car to get her EpiPen, which he struggled to find, but by the time he did find it, she was dead. A couple of weeks after the funeral, he got in his car, drove it back to the stretch of roadside where she died, put his foot down on the accelerator, and deliberately aimed his car at a power pole. He'd left his mum a note. More like a day horribly altered my life. I was a teacher and coach. For a field trip, the principal could not afford 2 buses, so I had to walk about 10 girls to the field trip location and back to school, while the one bus was filled with the rest of the junior high students and faculty. About a mile each way. I chose the girls of my team because they would listen to me outdoors, unlike lots of middle school kids. While crossing the street in the crosswalk, with the walk signal in our favor, all the kids went first, and like girls, they are clumped together and chatting while walking. I noticed a woman made a left turn into our crosswalk and never saw us as she tried to accelerate to beat an oncoming car. I knew she was going to run right through the girls. I pushed the kids forward, very forcefully. Most of the girls fell onto the pavement in front of other vehicles waiting at their red light. They were badly scraped up, like road rash from me pushing them. But no hospitals or doctors were needed for their scrapes. I don't remember the impact. I remember seeing a Pontiac symbol between the headlights. I came to, and I was in a whole different lane, and facing where I had just come from. I could not get up. They say my body went up the car and off the driver's side, tearing the side mirror off the car and breaking her windshield. Horror and sobbing from my student athletes. The girls raised me onto a backboard when the ambulance came, which must have been traumatic. Now, 20 years later, I am still an ambulatory wheelchair user. Can't teach or coach. Can't work at a desk. I have chronic pain. Yes, my life can be really wide, but I would not change what I did that day. When I get low emotionally from all my limitations, I remember those girls. I watch them go to college, get married, grow into mothers, and hold impressive jobs in their fields. And when they show a photo of their happy moment, it recharges me to know they are safe, healthy, and happy. And it reaffirms my decision to save them from harm. I distantly know somebody who tried to cross the U.S.-Canada border without declaring greater than $10,000 in cash, which led to them searching all his stuff and finding no porn on his computer. He's in jail. I used to work construction and was working on the border in Port Huron, me for a while. One of my co-workers and I went across a couple of times. First time, no problem. Second time we got stopped, and they asked if either of us had any previous felonies. He did. They searched everything before sending us back to our side of the border. He said, "Man, I'm glad I didn't bring the weed with me this time." This was in 1998, and such a thing would have been rather problematic. Come to find out, the first time we went, He did have the weed with him. Out drinking with friends. One tried to leave, but we had taken his keys. Said he was going outside for a smoke. We didn't know he had an emergency key in a magnetic box under his truck. We got a call from his brother later that night telling us he drove through a stop sign on a back road and T-boned a car. Car was driven by a mother who just finished her shift from the hospital and had just picked her kids up from her mom's and were all less than a mile from home when he hit them with his truck. The mom and her kids all died on the scene. My friend woke in the hospital and asked what happened to the family. Nurse told him they were all pronounced dead at the scene. He died shortly after, and docs didn't have an answer because he wasn't hurt badly. Dude couldn't live with what he'd done. Where I live in Become, there's an interesting driving law due to stories like these. When you get your learner's permit, you must drive with an adult with you for a year before you can take your second-level driving permit. That second-level permit has a restriction on how many passengers you can carry. You're allowed to drive as many family members as you want, but only one non-related passenger. The logic is that when one stupid HS kid gets himself fed, at least he won't also his 4 friends in the car with him. The usual objection I hear is that kids who will drink and drive drunk will also break the one-passenger rule. However, it's an easy rule for the cops to enforce. See a car full of teens, they're probably breaking that rule. I don't know if it's actually reduced the deaths from drunk driving, but I like the attempt. He had just turned 19, summer after senior year. Dad owns a very lucrative lumber sales and construction company. He got a brand new truck for graduation and was going to start his job after summer ended with his dad. Trained to be a foreman and basically be set for life on a path to retire extremely comfortably by the age of 55. He decided to take a bunch of pills and ran a red light. T-boned a car, ing the driver instantly and crippling the passenger for life. He got off with vehicular manslaughter because his dad forked out big money to get the charges lessened. He served 13 years and got out last year. He just walks around the town now because he can't get work, own a license, or vehicle. I didn't know this guy, but my friend was his nurse in hospital. He tried to hang himself with his belt from a tree branch. The branch snapped. He tried again. The branch snapped. At this point, he was severely injured. The doctors were amazed he managed a second attempt. Then in the hospital, he broke out of his restraints and managed to get out a window from the 4th floor. He hit an aircon mounted to the wall a few stories down, still alive. At this point, he did his back so badly that he was several centimeters shorter than when he'd started. His ribs were basically powder, and he'd broken both legs. Oh, and his skull was fractured, so they put him in one of those halo things. Apparently, he then started trying to bash his skull in with the halo. All I could think was, Jesus in Christ, just let the man go when he was telling me the story. A week ago, my little sister slipped on the ice getting out of her car and hit her head. She didn't think much of it when she had a pounding headache later, figuring she just whacked herself good. Her friend told her to just sit down and take it easy until she started slurring her words roughly 10 hours after the fall. They called an ambulance for her, but she was going into cardiac arrest. Turns out she'd stopped taking her blood thinners she was supposed to be on for clotting issues. The headache wasn't the fall, it was the clot in her leg, cutting off blood to the brain. At the age of 26, she never recovered and leaves behind a 4-year-old and 2-year-old. My daughter's middle school teacher exchanged nudes with a 14-year-old on Discord across state lines. When I was in junior school, no idea what you call that in America. There was a teacher in my school who used to touch girls and make them sit on his lap. He'd leave, then he'd be back a couple of months later, and he just did that for years. Shouted and made a girl cry once in the playground. I don't know what was going on, but now I see she clearly didn't want to do something. I tried calling out how creepy he was, but I remember getting shouted at by the principal. I can't remember the details, but all I remember is it felt like it was my fault for talking like that. I think some schools are more worried about their reputation than the safety of the students, staff, but Yale, no one did all about it. My English teacher, basketball coach was obsessed with me. which I always thought was a little weird, but didn't think too much of it because teachers always hated and been super rude to me, super racist area, and just being young and oblivious. He would talk pretty nasty and aggressive to the basketball team as if we weren't a bunch of 13 to 15-year-old girls. Like worse than a football coach, he'd literally degrade us. He got into it with my mom after a basketball game and wouldn't let her take my friend that we always carpooled with. I have no idea why it was an issue this time. And as my mom is apologizing to my friend and leaving with me, he's chasing her and yelling at the back of her head about the disrespectful, misbehaved child she has before she turns around and practically makes him sit down, yelling how he should be ashamed. The way you talk to and about these girls is disgusting. You're deflecting because everyone, including you, gives my daughter excellent reviews. Blah blah blah. I don't remember what all she said, but she roasted the out of him. I think she called him a Cheeto at one point. It lasted for a couple minutes, and as we turned to leave, all the girls clapped and cheered for my mom. Anyway, 2 years later, he's arrested for doing something very gross with a 14-year-old girl. I knew some boys at my school had a similar story, but they were brothers, cleaning the guns and fooling around. One brother put the gun to his brother's head and pulled the trigger. The kid died. No jail or anything, but he was not ever right. Awful tragedy. This comment got a large response, so I'd like to add some detail. I live in New Zealand, and this was in the 80s. No handguns, so it was rifles. Probably a .22. I grew up in the country, and it was not uncommon those days for primary-age children to handle and use guns. These boys should have known what they were doing, but yes, should have also had parental supervision for many reasons. We were Gen X, where were our parents? 30-plus year district renowned high school band director retires from teaching. High-end retirement party with a good amount of past students and colleagues celebrating his career. Daughter just had her first child. He's seemingly a happy grandfather with a happy marriage and happy life. 1 year later, he gets caught talking to a 13-year-old girl who turned out to be law enforcement undercover. The next 20 years in federal prison. I had to go back to check the validity of the sentence after all the comments. He got 10 years. Damage is all the same, though. I remember my last year of middle school, and we took a field trip to the high school for band CL. I met the band director, and I know from everyone, including my own siblings, how loved he was by everyone. Like probably the most popular teacher in the district. He creeped me out, though, in a way I couldn't explain. I didn't like him. A few weeks later, the same thing you described happened. Though this guy had also been assaulting girls as far back as when my siblings had him, which was over a decade prior. My siblings are 12 and 15 years older than me. One of the girls was in the same grade as my sister. I'm glad he's gone. But it's wild how someone like that can be so popular. He lit at dinner alone, choked, and died. My dad has the craziest choking story. In November 2020, he, his partner, and my grandmother all three caught COVID. Everyone came out fine, thank God, but still had a bit of a lingering cough. The day that he was able to come off quarantine, he decided to go fishing. He stopped at a local gas station for a fried snack and took his truck out to his favorite fishing hole. He says the last thing he remembers before regaining consciousness was popping one of those fried snacks in his mouth right as he began to cough. He started choking, and then he just blacked out. He woke up with the cab of his truck embedded into someone's living room. Cops had to investigate, and what they came up with is that my dad choked, completely blocked his airway, slumped over, hit the gas, jumped a 12-foot ditch, and hit the side of this woman's house. The impact caused the airbags to deploy, and that's what dislodged the food from his airway. They estimated he was going about 80 miles per hour when he hit. Speed limit on the road was 45. The woman was home, but thankfully on the opposite end of the house. She came out to see my dad sitting on the ground, confused and bawling. She was thankfully compassionate about it, recognized something was very wrong, and called him an ambulance. My dad survived choking because he hit a house with his truck. Father of two here. Like most dads, I often play with them. Bit of rough and tumble, but nothing dangerous. But even when you're being careful, sometimes they'll move or twist in an unexpected way that suddenly makes the situation quite perilous. On a few occasions, I've definitely had my heart in my mouth as you watch with horror as a safe situation turns into something potentially life-threatening. Then sometimes random happens. My 3-year-old son was sitting on this chair, putting his shoes on. Out of absolutely nowhere, the understairs cupboard door literally just fell off its hinges and started falling towards him. It's not the biggest or heaviest door in the world, but it was tipping fast, and the corner was going right for his head. I managed to throw myself into it before it hit him, and broke 2 of my fingers in the process. Life is scary. Assuming this was indeed just a tragic error of judgment, my heart bleeds for that guy. K-Kid at my high school had a full ride to Penn State. We came from a pretty affluent town, but he was raised by a lower middle class single mom who worked her off to afford to live in that town with those schools. They were my neighbors. End of senior year, this dip pulled the first alarm. The teacher who saw him tried to keep it a secret, but a second teacher had seen him as well. Kid was charged, lost his scholarship, and had his offer rescinded. 15 years later, and I know his little brother, and I know that he's still living in a crappy apartment working a Thai job. Never even attempted to go back to school or anything. What a life wasted. When I was 6 or 7, I went to a daytime summer camp. I didn't know anyone else there. It was the first day and everyone was milling around in the gym just waiting for everything to get organized. Some kid pulled the fire alarm and it was chaos. No one knew what to do. All the kids were still standing around since there was no evacuation. I was looking around and saw some kid pointing at me with 2 adults standing next to him. They both rushed over to me and said, "Why did you do it? Why did you do it?" I was stunned. I didn't know what to say. Another adult walked over and said, "Come on, we got him." The adult standing next to me said, "No, here he is right here." The adult that came over said, "No, it's not. We saw the kid that did it." They all walked away from me. I was standing around trying to figure out what just happened when I saw the kid that pointed at me. He was just staring at me. Reminds me of a hospital patient I drew blood from a few times when I worked in phlebotomy. He was an inmate. He'd made a failed attempt similar to what you've described. No nose, no lower jaw, one eye missing, and barely able to see anything from the other eye. He always had a sopping wet towel draped over his shoulders and on his chest because he was constantly drooling. My father happened to be one of the corrections officers assigned to watch him while he was admitted under the hospital's care and told me a bit about what he was like. He'd laugh after almost everything he said. When asked about it, he said it was just an impulse that he couldn't control. He sounded like he felt surprisingly good about his life. But I'm assuming that he just got really lucky with whatever part of his brain was damaged. He has no memory whatsoever of his life before the attempt, and my dad says he seems like a genuinely well-intentioned person despite whatever crime he committed that landed him in there. It had changed him into a completely unrecognizable person from who he used to be, both physically and mentally. He was friendly, and always in a good mood, except for when he'd wake up at night. He'd wake up screaming from night terrors several times every night, and it scared the out of everyone else on the ward. When aunts were adopted when my mum grew up in the UK in the 60s, met their birth family on a trip back there as adults. Then the biological dad decided to come to Australia a few months later and meet the grandkids, my uncles, etc. He stayed with one twin who had older boys for a month incident-free. Yet within a few days of starting his stay with the other twin, it became apparent my 4-year-old cousin didn't like him. One afternoon, cousin keeps saying he's a mean man. That night my aunt goes to pop my cousin in the bath and has got 2 handprints on his inner thighs and genitals just starting to bruise. My aunt rang the police and there was taken away and eventually charged. Deported back to the UK. Who does that after being so lucky to have the twins welcome him into his life? He lost his old family, still with birth mum, and his new family in Australia all in one day. Such a piece of. Friend of mine from a wealthy Middle Eastern country. Family didn't quite ruin his life, but ended up for a while. Was in Canada on a student visa but was working after graduating and had applied for permanent residency. Got rejected. So he took out every credit card he could find and ran them all up because he was leaving the country forever that week. Tells his parents he is coming home and why. Mom makes a few phone calls and turns out the kid had screwed up some paperwork, and it was no problem to get it fixed up and approved. That was 15 years ago, and he still lives here. But his credit card debt was more than his annual salary, and his parents told him he was an idiot and to pay it himself. He also lost out on a job opportunity the next year because his credit was such a disaster. Kai worked for a company that had a very prestigious grad program. Getting in and completing it was a fast track to senior management either in our firm or any other in our industry. We treated them very well and had a social event for the new intake. One of the grads assaulted one of the other grads. She decided not to take it to the police, even though we encouraged her to, and offered her all the support she needed to deal with it. Needless to say, he was immediately fired and blackballed from the entire industry. One of the senior managers who recruited the guy took his mistake very personally and has been following his career closely via LinkedIn. Every time he gets a half-decent job, a discreet phone call is made and he fails his probation. Kid I knew growing up and was friends with was 16, and his friend who was 15 lured two other kids to a field who were 13 and 16 where they shot them and dismembered them over weed. Weren't found for 2 weeks, and only because the one kid showed another kid. Ruined many families and lives that day. This was a shock to our entire community. Neither one of the boys who had them had prior criminal history or any sort of issues anyone knew or picked up on. My ex from when I was 17 got in car accident from drunk driving and trying to street race, lost control on a corner and hit a tree. The impact instantly ate him, sending his head halfway through the windshield, and ejected his cousin out of the car who lived. He was missing his pinky at the funeral, and the pictures of the car was gut-wrenching. Fast forward to present time, his uncle was arrested for murder a few years back of a 21-year-old girl he shot execution style and left in a field. I stayed a summer with them when I was with my ex, and it's crazy to think that I could have been in danger at any given time. Not as serious as some of these stories, but I worked with a guy that was using his shift manager key holder status to steal money and make it look like new hires did it. I had caught on to him and approached the owner when the owner was contemplating firing yet another new hire, convincing him to hold off and until after this dude's next shift. The owner turned the cameras to face the desk area where the drawer was counted, which also showed the safe. Prior to this, he used the cameras to make sure we were safe. He was a good boss. Before his next shift, though, he shows up really early during one of my shifts just for a glass of water and disappears to the back for a sec before leaving without another word. I call up our boss. He checks the camera. Sure enough, he went into the safe. Boss says, "Don't touch anything. I will be there before your shift is over with a locksmith." An hour or two later, some cops show up looking for this guy because they found his wallet in a building that had been broken into and vandalized the night before. Our boss shows up then, and they have a long discussion. I find out later it was an elementary school. He had taken pretty much all the money out of the safe and had also wrecked his frat bro's car. These cops were basically on a crime spree scavenger hunt at this point. He got kicked out of the frat, lost his scholarships, and had to drop out. My high school classmate's brother was driving and he had friends in the bed of his truck. His truck rolling one girl. The town wanted to him after she died, including her father, and my little brother, who I didn't know at the time, was very much in love with her. The brother was charged with negligent manslaughter, but because he was a minor, he had to serve jail time until he was 18, also had to take mandatory therapy, and so on. I don't know where he is now, but he was so horrified and upset.